The atmospheric pressure on HFY was not merely heavy. It was a physical insult, a persistent weight that felt like the planet itself was trying to squeeze the marrow from the bones of any interloper brave or foolish enough to walk its surface. Commander Vane adjusted the seals on his reinforced hardsuit, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical whine of the external servos struggling against the gravity that was nearly triple the standard galactic baseline. He looked out through the reinforced quartz visor at the horizon, where the sky was a bruised shade of violet, thick with suspended metallic dust that shimmered like a fever dream under the bloated orange sun. The Carsuvians, a species of hexaptal molluscoids encased in natural chitinous armor, moved through this crushing environment with a fluid grace that seemed to mock the rigid, clanking efforts of the humans. They had summoned the human delegation to this desolate outpost not for diplomacy, but for a demonstration of what they termed the inevitable hierarchy of the physical. To the Carsuvians and the broader hegemony they represented, humanity was a biological curiosity, a frail, bipedal species from a low-gravity rock that had no business claiming sovereignty over the mineral-rich veins of the deep rim systems. Vane knew that today was not about words. It was about the fundamental physics of endurance, a test the hegemony assumed the humans would fail before the first hour had passed. The primary arbiter of the hegemony, a massive creature named Zolvat, whose shell was inlaid with iridescent patterns of status, gestured with a sensory tentacle toward a massive monolith of solid iridium resting in the center of the testing plaza. The task was deceptively simple: move the monolith from the central dais to the ceremonial archway 300 meters away. There were no tools allowed, no anti-gravity assists, and no psychic manipulation. It was a test of raw kinetic output and structural integrity. The hegemony believed that because humans were tall and spindly by galactic standards, their skeletal systems would simply collapse under the combined strain of the planet's pull and the iridium's mass. Vane looked at his team, a group of 4 engineers and 2 soldiers, all of whom had been training in high-gravity centrifuges for 18 months in anticipation of this specific provocation. They didn't look like the sleek, hydrodynamic Carsuvians or the towering, crystalline forms of the Lithos who watched from the observation galleries. They looked like blocks of granite wrapped in industrial fabric. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and devoid of the wasted energy the hegemony prized as elegance. "You have been granted the privilege of the first attempt," Zolvat's voice buzzed through the translation matrix, the tone carrying a vibration of smug certainty. "Should your frames fail, the hegemony will assume administration of the rim sector to spare your species the burden of labor they are clearly not evolved to sustain." Vane didn't respond with a speech about freedom or the human spirit. He simply tapped his comms and gave the order for the formation. The 6 humans moved toward the monolith, their boots cracking the obsidian tiles of the plaza with every step. They didn't approach the stone as a heavy object to be lifted. They approached it as a problem of leverage and communal vectors. They took their positions, leaning their backs against the cold, dark metal, digging their heels into the ground until the servos in their suits screamed in protest. The hegemony observers leaned forward, expecting to hear the sickening snap of human femurs or the hiss of suit integrity failing. Instead, they heard a low, rhythmic grunt, a sound that had echoed through human history from the building of the pyramids to the assembly of the first Martian domes. It was the sound of a species that had spent its entire existence fighting a planet that didn't want them to stand up. The monolith didn't move at first. For a full minute, it seemed as though the humans were merely posing against the stone, a frozen tableau of futility. But then, a hairline fracture appeared in the obsidian tile beneath the lead engineer's right foot. The pressure the humans were exerting was so concentrated that the very foundation of the plaza was beginning to give way before their resolve did. Vane felt the heat building in his suit, the cooling fans spinning at their absolute limit, but he focused only on the sensation of his muscles screaming in unison with his teammates. They weren't just pushing with their arms, they were pushing with their entire history of being the underdog. They used a technique of micro-oscillations, vibrating their weight in a synchronized pattern that began to hum through the iridium. It was a slow, agonizing process, but then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the static friction was broken. The monolith groaned, a deep, metallic protest that shook the plaza, and it shifted forward by a single centimeter. The silence from the observation gallery was absolute. To the Hegemony, this was a violation of biological probability. As the humans continued their grueling march, centimeter by agonizing centimeter, the sun began to sink lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the plaza. Every step was a calculated risk, every breath a battle against the thickening atmosphere. Vane could feel the sweat stinging his eyes, but he couldn't reach to wipe it. He could feel the pulse thumping in his temples, a drumbeat of stubbornness. They were halfway to the archway when Zolvat moved closer, the Arbiter's many eyes flickering with a mixture of confusion and growing irritation. The Hegemony had existed for 10,000 years on the principle that the strong commanded and the weak served, and strength was measured by the ease with which one dominated their environment. These humans were not dominating, they were suffering, yet they were not stopping. This was a form of power the Hegemony had no metric for the power of sustained, agonizing effort. Vane locked eyes with the Arbiter through his visor, his face twisted in a grimace of exertion that the Karsuvian likely mistook for a snarl of aggression. It wasn't aggression, it was the look of a man who had decided that the universe's laws of physics were merely suggestions. By the time the monolith crossed the threshold of the ceremonial archway, the human team was vibrating with exhaustion. Their hard suits were venting steam into the cool evening air, and the obsidian path behind them was a ruined trail of shattered stone and deep gouges. They didn't collapse. They stood there, leaning against the iridium they had just conquered, their chests heaving in the heavy air. Vane unlatched his helmet, a move that was technically against safety protocols given the sulfur content of the air, but he wanted the Hegemony to see his face. He wanted them to see the raw, red-faced reality of a human being who had just done the impossible. He coughed, the harsh air burning his lungs, but he forced a smile that was more of a baring of teeth. Zolvat approached, the iridescent plates of his shell clicking in a slow, rhythmic pattern of begrudging acknowledgement. The Arbiter looked at the ruined plaza, then at the monolith, and finally at the 6 exhausted bipeds who had moved a mountain. "Your biology is inefficient," Zolvat finally broadcasted, the translator struggling with the nuances of the Karsuvian's altered tone. "You waste immense energy to achieve what a more evolved form would do with gravity tethers. You suffer needlessly. Why do you choose this path of most resistance?" Vane wiped a smear of grease and sweat from his forehead, his legs trembling but holding firm. He looked at the massive stone, a symbol of their right to exist in the Deep Rim, and then back at the alien lord. He realized then that the Hegemony lived in a universe of constants, where everything was settled by the luck of birth and the ease of environment. They had never had to invent a way to be more than what they were. They had never had to fight their own gravity just to take a first step. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their weapons. It was the fact that they were used to the universe being a heavy, difficult place that required a lot of pushing. "We don't choose the resistance," Vane said, his voice raspy but clear enough for the sensors to pick up. "The resistance is just there. We just don't let it tell us where to stop. You see a waste of energy. We see the only way to get where we're going. If you want the rim sector, you're going to have to move us, and I promise you, we're a lot heavier than that rock." The Arbiter turned away, the shimmering colors of his shell fading to a dull, contemplative gray. The challenge was over, but the message had been sent. As the human team began the long, slow walk back to their dropship, Vane felt the weight of the planet more than ever, but he also felt the strange, defiant lightness that came from knowing that no matter how hard the universe pushed, humans would always push back harder. They weren't the strongest, the smartest, or the most advanced, but they were the most stubborn thing in the stars, and in a galaxy of giants that was going to be more than enough to change the geometry of power forever. The dropship's interior was a sanctuary of filtered air and standard gravity, but even as the pressure eased, the team remained silent. The gravity of their achievement still settled in their bones. They stripped off their hard suits, revealing the deep bruises and burst capillaries that were the price of their victory. Vane watched them, his heart swelling with a pride that was tempered by the knowledge of what was to come. This was only the beginning. The Hegemony wouldn't retreat because of one moved rock. They would merely recalibrate their hostility. But as he looked at the sensor readouts of the planet receding below them, he knew that the Karsuvians had seen something they couldn't unsee. They had seen that humans didn't need to be gods to challenge them. They just needed to be willing to break themselves against the impossible until the impossible gave way. It was a terrifying realization for a species that built its empire on the certainty of their own superiority, and Vane intended to make sure that terror grew with every star system they claimed. The council chamber of the High Hegemony was not a room so much as a geological formation, a hollowed-out spire of translucent obsidian that rose from the tectonic plates of the throne world, vibrating with the constant, low-frequency hum of the planet's molten core. Zolvat stood upon the central pedestal, his many limbs folded in a posture of profound contemplation as the holographic archives replayed the footage from Kasov 4. To the gathered representatives of the 5 primary castes, the sight of the humans struggling against the iridium monolith was grotesque, a display of primitive biomechanics that should have resulted in total systemic failure. They watched the humans' skin turn a dark, angry red, watched the steam vent from their crude mechanical suits, and heard the rhythmic, guttural grunting that the linguistic processors had categorized as a survival-level respiratory bypass. The Grand Vizier of the Lithos, a being whose body was a lattice of shimmering sapphire crystals, pulsed with a sharp, discordant light that signaled intense skepticism. To the Lithos, life was a matter of structural perfection and resonance. The human display was an affront to the very concept of ordered existence, yet the result was undeniable. The stone had moved, and with it, the established borders of the Deep Rim had shifted in a way that no fleet of warships could have achieved. Vane was not present for this deliberation, nor would he have cared to be. He was currently 300 light-years away, standing in the cramped, utilitarian corridor of the human colony ship Vanguard. The ship was a repurposed freighter, its hull scarred by micrometeoroid impacts and its interior smelling of recycled oxygen and industrial lubricant. Unlike the elegant, gravity-defying vessels of the Hegemony, the Vanguard was built on the principle of redundant systems and mechanical honesty. Every bolt was visible, every conduit accessible. Vane was meeting with the chief architect of the Rim settlements, a woman named Aris, who had spent the last decade designing structures that could survive environments where the very air was a corrosive acid. Aris didn't look like a hero of the expansion. She looked like a mechanic, her hands stained with the grit of a dozen worlds and her hair tied back in a messy, practical knot. She was showing Vane the blueprints for the first permanent human outpost on Kasov 4, a project the Hegemony believed was physically impossible without their proprietary gravity-anchoring technology. The design Aris presented was not a tower or a dome, but a sprawling, subterranean network of interlocking hexagons that used the planet's own crushing gravity as a stabilizing force. She explained that by angling the foundations into the bedrock at specific degrees, the weight of the atmosphere would actually compress the materials into a denser, stronger state, effectively using the planet's hostility as a primary building material. Vane looked at the complex math shimmering on the display, a dense forest of variables and geometric proofs that described a life lived in constant tension. He realized then that humanity's approach to the galaxy was fundamentally different from any other species they had encountered. The Hegemony sought to bypass the environment, to hover above it in a state of technological grace. Humans sought to engage with it, to find the friction and use it to propel themselves forward. It was a philosophy of struggle, a belief that the only way to truly own a place was to let it change you as much as you changed it. Meanwhile, in the Obsidian Spire, the debate reached a fever pitch as Zolvat presented his findings on human history. He had delved into the digital shards of their pre-spaceflight era, finding a terrifying obsession with endurance. He spoke of their marathons, their climbs of oxygen-starved peaks, and their strange habit of intentionally seeking out hardship for the sake of internal growth. The Hegemony members found this incomprehensible. To them, intelligence was the tool used to eliminate hardship, not a reason to pursue it. Zolvat projected a map of the Rim sector, highlighting the human movements. They weren't expanding in the logical, resource-driven patterns of the other races. They were colonizing the dead zones, planets with erratic orbits, high radiation, or crushing pressures that the Hegemony had deemed worthless. By the time the Hegemony realized the value of these worlds, the humans would have already integrated themselves into the local ecology through sheer force of will and engineering. The humans weren't just taking territory, they were redefining what it meant for a territory to be habitable. Vane's conversation with Aris was interrupted by a proximity alert. A Hegemony scout ship, a sleek needle of silver and light, had dropped out of warp just outside the colony's defensive perimeter. They weren't attacking, they were observing. They were watching the humans unload massive crates of pre-stressed alloys and geothermal drills onto the surface of a moon that was little more than a jagged shard of ice and volcanic rock. Vane stepped onto the observation deck, watching the Hegemony ship hover like a silent ghost. He knew what they were seeing. They were seeing humans in bulky suits, moving through a landscape that should have killed them, building a home in a place that offered nothing but resistance. He felt a strange sense of kinship with the alien observers. They were looking for the secret to human power, looking for the advanced weapon or the hidden energy source that allowed them to defy the odds. They wouldn't find it in the machines. They would find it in the way the human workers leaned into the wind, the way they shared a thermal pack in the freezing dark, and the way they laughed even when their lungs ached from the cold. As the weeks passed, the first outpost on Kasov 4 began to take shape. It was a grueling process that claimed the lives of 3 engineers when a pocket of pressurized gas erupted during a foundation drill, but the work never stopped. In the Hegemony, a catastrophe of that scale would have led to an immediate withdrawal and a decade of bureaucratic mourning. For the humans, it was a tragedy that was honored by redoubling the effort. They buried their dead in the very soil they were claiming, literally anchoring their presence in the planet with the bodies of those who had paved the way. This was the part of the human psyche that truly terrified Zolvat. Most species were driven by survival, but humans seemed driven by a desire to make their survival mean something, even if they weren't around to see the result. The Arbiter began to suspect that the Hegemony's long peace had made them fragile. They had forgotten how to bleed for a cause, while the humans had never forgotten because they had never stopped bleeding. Back on the Vanguard, Vane received a message from the Hegemony Council. It was not a demand for withdrawal, but an invitation for a second exchange. They wanted to see the human outpost for themselves. They wanted to understand how a species with such limited biological advantages could build something permanent in a high-gravity hellscape. Vane accepted, but he insisted on one condition. The Hegemony representatives would have to walk through the outpost without their gravity-nullifying belts. He wanted them to feel the weight of the world the humans had claimed. He wanted them to understand that the architecture of human success was built on a foundation of shared burden. Aris was nervous about the visit, worried that the outpost was still too raw, too industrial to impress the refined tastes of the hegemony, but Vane told her that beauty wasn't what they were trying to project. They were projecting stability. They were showing the galaxy that humans weren't just visitors. They were a new part of the landscape, and they weren't going anywhere. When the hegemony delegation arrived, led by a visibly uncomfortable Zolvat, the experience was transformative. As they stepped out of their shuttle and deactivated their gravity shunts, the sheer force of Kasov 4 slammed into them. The Lithos delegate's crystalline structure let out a series of high-pitched pings as the internal stresses shifted, and Zolvat had to deploy all 6 of his limbs just to maintain his balance. They walked through the human tunnels, seeing the way the walls were reinforced with local basalt and the way the air recyclers hummed with a fierce, mechanical determination. They saw the human colonists, their faces etched with the fatigue of their environment, yet moving with a purpose that seemed to defy the physical constraints of the room. There were no grand statues or golden ornaments here, only the stark beauty of functional design and the quiet intensity of a people who had decided that this world belonged to them because they were willing to pay the price of admission in sweat and stubbornness. By the end of the tour, the hegemony delegates were exhausted, their physical forms taxed to the limit by the mere act of standing in a human-built space. Zolvat looked at Vane, his sensory organs drooping with the weight of the atmosphere. He realized that the human outpost wasn't just a building. It was a physical manifestation of a psychological trait the hegemony had evolved out of millennia ago. It was a monument to the idea that the universe does not give you anything. You have to take it, and then you have to hold on to it with everything you have. The Arbiter didn't offer a compliment, but as he boarded his shuttle to return to the comfort of his high-tech spire, he made a note in the Imperial record. He wrote that the humans were not a threat because of their technology, but because of their relationship with failure. To a human, failure was just another form of friction, and friction was the only thing that allowed you to move forward. The chapter concluded with Vane and Aris standing on the surface of Kasov 4, watching the hegemony ship disappear into the violet clouds. The wind was howling, a savage, metallic scream that tore at the edges of their suits. Vane reached out and touched the cold, dark wall of the outpost, feeling the vibration of the machines deep inside the rock. He knew that the hegemony would come back, and next time they might bring their fleets instead of their diplomats. But as he looked at the lights of the colony glowing defiantly against the dark, he wasn't afraid. Humans had spent their entire history learning how to stand up on a planet that wanted them to stay down. The galaxy was just a bigger version of the same problem, and they already had the blueprints for the solution. The hegemony did not respond with a fleet, at least not initially. They responded with a blockade of silence that felt heavier than the atmosphere of Kasov 4. Trade routes that had once flickered with the promise of exchange were suddenly diverted, and the human colonies in the Deep Rim found themselves isolated, their lifelines to the core worlds severed by a bureaucratic decree from the Obsidian Spire. Vane watched the sensor arrays of the Vanguard as the last of the merchant frigates from the Lithos territories pivoted away from their sector, their thrusters leaving cold, mocking trails in the vacuum. This was the hegemony's preferred method of warfare, the slow strangulation of an upstart species through the denial of resources. They expected the humans to wither, to see their machines fail for lack of specialized parts, and their people grow thin as the nutrient synthesizers broke down. They believed that without the grace of the hegemony's superior supply chains, the humans would finally understand that their stubbornness was a debt they could no longer afford to pay. Vane convened a meeting in the ship's mess hall, a room that had become the heartbeat of the resistance. It was filled with the smell of scorched ozone and the sharp tang of cheap coffee, a beverage that had become a symbol of human persistence. Aris sat at the head of the table, her eyes bloodshot from 48 hours of reconfiguring the colony's power grids. She had a tablet in front of her, displaying a series of cascading failures in the primary life support systems of the outlying research stations. The Hegemony had cut off the supply of rare earth catalysts required to maintain the atmospheric scrubbers, a move that should have made the outposts uninhabitable within a lunar cycle. But Aris wasn't looking for a way to beg for mercy. She was looking for a way to turn the very dirt of Kassav 4 into a chemical filter. She spoke of grinding down the native basalt, of using the high-pressure volcanic vents to bake impurities out of the air, and of 100 other desperate, brilliant improvisations that the Hegemony's engineers would have considered barbaric. The struggle shifted from the physical labor of moving stones to the intellectual labor of surviving in a vacuum of support. The humans began a process they called gut ripping, where they dismantled non-essential systems to keep the core machinery running. They stripped the luxury liners of their inertial dampeners to build makeshift mining drills and used the decorative plating of their diplomatic halls to patch holes in their fusion reactors. It was a period of intense, focused desperation that transformed the colony from a collection of buildings into a single, breathing organism. Vane walked through the tunnels of the outpost, seeing children helping their parents sort through piles of scrap metal and elders teaching the youth how to weld with primitive arc torches. There was no panic, only a grim, quiet industry that seemed to hum through the walls. The Hegemony had underestimated the human capacity for making do with less, a trait forged in the slums of old Earth and perfected in the cold shadows of the lunar colonies. In the high Hegemony, Zolvat watched the surveillance feeds with a growing sense of unease. He saw the humans using wooden struts where steel should be, saw them eating synthesized algae that his own people wouldn't use for fertilizer, and saw them continuing to expand their perimeter even as their oxygen levels dipped into the danger zone. To the Arbiter, this was not rational behavior. It was a form of biological madness, a refusal to accept the reality of scarcity. He reported to the Grand Vizier that the blockade was not working as intended. Instead of weakening the humans, it was tempering them, burning away the soft parts of their society and leaving behind something hard and sharp. The Hegemony had intended to starve a pest. They were instead creating a weapon. The Vizier, however, remained unmoved, convinced that the laws of entropy were absolute and that the humans would eventually reach their breaking point. The breaking point came, but not in the way the Hegemony expected. On the 100th day of the blockade, a massive seismic event rocked Kassav 4, a localized tectonic shift that threatened to collapse the main subterranean galleries of the human outpost. The Hegemony observers watched from orbit, prepared to offer humanitarian terms of surrender as the colony's structural integrity failed. Vane was in the lower levels when the first tremors hit, the sound like the grinding of a million rusted hinges. He saw the reinforced basalt walls buckle under the weight of the shifting crust, heard the scream of shearing metal as the main supports began to give way. But instead of fleeing toward the surface, the human workers rushed toward the breach. They threw their bodies into the effort, using manual jacks and raw muscle to hold back the encroaching rock. They worked in shifts, their hands bleeding, their lungs burning with the dust of the planet's heart, refusing to let the mountain take what they had built. Aris arrived at the breach with a team of demolition experts, but they didn't have enough explosives to stabilize the fault line. She looked at Vane, her face caked in gray dust, and told him that they needed to trigger a controlled collapse of the upper ventilation shafts to relieve the pressure on the living quarters. It was a move that would permanently halve their air supply and force the entire population into a cramped, miserable existence for the foreseeable future. Vane didn't hesitate, he gave the order. He watched as the explosions rippled through the ceiling, watched the ceiling come down in a roar of debris, and felt the sudden, sickening drop in air pressure as the volume of their habitat was slashed. They were now living in a tomb of their own making, yet as the dust settled, a cheer went up from the workers. They were alive. They had traded comfort for existence, and to a human, that was always a winning bargain. The Hegemony's response to this act of self-mutilation was a mixture of horror and fascination. Zolvat realized that the humans didn't value their lives in the same way the Hegemony did. For the Karsuvians or the Lithos, life was a precious flame to be protected at all costs. For the humans, life was a fuel to be burned in the pursuit of a goal. They would spend themselves until there was nothing left if it meant their species moved an inch further into the dark. This was a fundamental misalignment of values that made traditional diplomacy impossible. You cannot negotiate with a fire that wants to consume everything in its path, and you cannot intimidate a people who are already living in their own wreckage. The Arbiter began to draft a new proposal, one that recognized the humans not as a client race, but as a sovereign anomaly that required a new category of engagement. As the months turned into a year, the starved colony of Kassav 4 became a legend among the other fringe races of the Hegemony. Rumors spread of the bipeds who lived on stone and air, who built machines out of garbage, and who looked at the void and laughed. The blockade began to crack, not from human force, but from the curiosity and secret admiration of the Hegemony's own subjects. Small-time traders began to slip through the gaps, bringing seeds, medicine, and technology in exchange for the rugged, over-engineered tools the humans had perfected in their isolation. The humans had turned their desperation into a commodity. They sold the Karsuvian-grade drills that could cut through anything, and the Vanguard logic software that could run on a broken processor. They weren't just surviving, they were beginning to influence the very empire that was trying to erase them. Vane stood on the surface of the planet once more, his suit now a patchwork of different alloys, his face aged by the constant stress of command. He looked up at the stars, no longer seeing them as distant points of light, but as a map of potential battlegrounds. He knew the Hegemony would eventually realize their mistake and move from economic pressure to military force. He knew that the peace they had won was a fragile thing, held together by nothing more than their own refusal to die. But as he watched a new group of colonists arrive, their eyes wide with the same stubborn fire he felt in his own chest, he knew they were ready. They had learned the calculus of endurance. They knew exactly how much it cost to stay alive, and they were more than willing to pay it. The chapter ended with a transmission from the High Hegemony, delivered not by a drone, but by a high-ranking env. The message was simple. The blockade was lifted, and the human presence on Kassav 4 was formally recognized as a permanent hardship zone under autonomous human control. It was a victory, but a bitter one, a recognition that the Hegemony didn't want the planet anymore because they were afraid of what it had turned the humans into. Vane watched the Envoy's ship depart, a sleek, beautiful thing that looked fragile against the violent purple sky. He turned back toward the entrance of the outpost, the heavy steel door grinding shut behind him with a sound that echoed through the bedrock. They had survived the silence, and now they were ready to make some noise. The lifting of the blockade was not an act of mercy, but a tactical retreat of the Hegemony's ideological certainty. By declaring Kassav 4 a permanent hardship zone, they were attempting to quarantine the human spirit, treating their tenacity like a contagious pathogen that might infect the more compliant species of the Rim. Vane understood this perfectly as he watched the first legitimate supply freighters dock at the battered orbital ring. These vessels were manned by the Grell, a scavenger-caste species whose multiple ocular stalks twitched with frantic energy as they took in the state of the human fleet. The human ships were no longer the polished explorers that had first arrived. They were jagged, asymmetrical monstrosities of welded plating and jury-rigged kinetic batteries. The Grell merchants brought with them refined alloys and medical canisters, but they left with something far more valuable to the human cause: data on the Hegemony's internal unrest. The reports suggested that the Lithos were questioning the cost of the blockade, and the Karsuvian military was increasingly agitated by the human presence so close to their sovereign nursery worlds. The tension within the human leadership was equally taut, centered on the construction of the Great Forge, a massive thermal tap project designed by Aris to harness the planet's mantle for large-scale manufacturing. If successful, it would allow the colony to produce heavy void frigates without the need for imported materials, effectively ending their dependence on the Hegemony's whim. Aris worked in the deep-bore sectors, where the heat was so intense it required liquid nitrogen cooling loops woven into her clothing. She was overseeing the placement of the magnetic containment rings, huge circles of superconducting wire that would channel the magma's energy into the station's capacitors. The risk was astronomical. A single misalignment would trigger a crustal rupture that could swallow the entire outpost. Vane visited the site frequently, not to supervise, but to remind himself of the scale of their ambition. He found Aris standing on a catwalk over a lake of molten rock, her face illuminated by a hellish orange glow that made her look like a figure from an ancient myth. The Hegemony eventually realized that the hardship zone was becoming a fortress. They sent a military observer, a high-ranking Karsuvian named Traxol, who arrived not with a merchant's curiosity, but with a conqueror's scrutiny. Traxol was a veteran of the expansion wars, his shell scarred by plasma burns and his demeanor as cold as the void. He was escorted through the Great Forge by Vane, who made no effort to hide the industrial brutality of the project. The Karsuvian general watched the human laborers moving through the heat, their bodies lean and corded with muscle, their movements synchronized with a terrifying efficiency. He saw the way they handled the heavy tools, not as burdens, but as extensions of their own limbs. Traxol noted that the humans did not use the graceful, automated drones common in Hegemony factories. They insisted on manual oversight at every critical junction. When he asked why they chose such a dangerous and exhausting method, Vane told him that a machine can be hacked or jammed, but a human with a wrench and a sense of ownership will never stop turning the bolt until the job is done. The visit took a dark turn when Traxol demanded to see the weapon's testing range. Vane led him to a desolate canyon on the surface, where the wind-blown metallic dust obscured the horizon. There, the humans demonstrated their latest development, the mass driver. Unlike the elegant beam weapons of the Hegemony, which relied on complex focusing crystals and immense power draws, the mass driver was a primitive railgun that used electromagnetic rails to hurl a slab of tungsten at a significant fraction of light speed. The weapon was loud, violent, and utterly devastating. When the tungsten slug impacted a decommissioned Hegemony-style shield generator, the resulting kinetic energy didn't just pierce the shield. It shattered the entire apparatus into microscopic shards. Traxol was visibly shaken, his many eyes dilating in a biological reflex of fear. He realized that the humans had turned the very gravity of HFY into a weaponized philosophy. They weren't trying to outtech the Hegemony, they were trying to outpunch them. In the nights that followed, Vane and Aris sat in the quiet of the command center, looking at the structural reports of the forge. The project was nearing completion, but the strain on the colony's workforce was reaching a critical mass. People were tired, not just in their bodies, but in their souls. The constant pressure of the planet and the threat of the Hegemony had created a culture of perpetual alertness that left no room for rest. Vane saw it in the way his officers walked, the way their eyes darted toward the ceiling at every minor tremor. He knew that a species built for struggle still needed a reason to keep struggling beyond mere survival. He decided to authorize the construction of a communal space, a garden built with recycled water and artificial sunlight, where the colonists could see something that wasn't gray, brown, or orange. It was a small gesture, a waste of resources by any hegemony standard, but it was the most important thing he had done since arriving on the planet. The hegemony's response to Traxol's report was a sudden and violent shift in policy. They realized that the humans were not just a nuisance, they were a systemic threat to the hegemony's monopoly on power. A fleet of 3 heavy cruisers, led by the pride of the Carsuvian Navy, the Apex Shell, entered the system with orders to decommission the Great Forge, citing environmental safety violations. It was a transparent pretext for an act of war. Vane watched the massive ships descend through the violet clouds, their hulls shimmering with the blue light of their defensive screens. He didn't call for a retreat. He didn't even call for a parley. He simply signaled Aris to activate the Forge's primary capacitors. The entire planet seemed to groan as the massive magnetic rings hummed to life, drawing a terrifying amount of energy from the molten core. The sky above the outpost began to ionize, crackling with static discharges that mirrored the anger of the humans below. As the Apex Shell lowered its primary battery, preparing to incinerate the Forge from the air, the humans fired their mass drivers from the canyon floors. The recoil from the weapons was so intense that it registered as a minor earthquake across the hemisphere. The tungsten slugs tore through the thick atmosphere, leaving trails of burning plasma in their wake. The Hegemony cruisers, accustomed to fighting against beam weapons that could be deflected or diffused, were completely unprepared for the sheer kinetic force of the human projectiles. The first slug hit the Apex Shell's forward shield at an oblique angle, the energy transfer so massive that it buckled the ship's internal frame. The second slug hit the secondary cruiser square in the engine block, the tungsten liquefying on impact and spraying the interior of the ship with a molten rain that turned the vessel into a drifting tomb in seconds. The third ship, seeing its sisters crippled in a single exchange, pulled back into the upper atmosphere, its sensors blinded by the electromagnetic storm the Forge had created. The victory was brief but decisive. The Hegemony fleet retreated to the outer edge of the system, leaving the humans to deal with the aftermath of their defiance. Vane stood on the observation deck, watching the burning wreckage of the secondary cruiser streak across the sky like a falling star. He knew that the Hegemony would return with a much larger force, but he also knew that the rules of the engagement had changed forever. The humans had shown that they could not only survive the pressure of a hostile world, but could turn that pressure outward against those who sought to contain them. Aris joined him, her cooling suit humming quietly, her face weary but triumphant. She told him that the Forge was stable and that the first batch of frigate hulls was already being cast in the subterranean molds. They were no longer a colony, they were a shipyard. The chapter concluded with a scene in the new garden where the human workers gathered to breathe air that didn't taste like metal. They looked at the green leaves of the Earth origin ferns and the small, vibrant flowers that had managed to bloom in the artificial light. There was no music, only the sound of water dripping into a stone basin and the distant, rhythmic thud of the mass drivers being reloaded in the canyons. Vane stood among his people, feeling the weight of the planet and the weight of his command. He realized that the Hegemony's greatest mistake was thinking that humans were fighting for a piece of land or a vein of ore. They were fighting for the right to be difficult. They were fighting for the right to exist in a way that made the rest of the galaxy uncomfortable. As the violet sun set behind the jagged mountains, casting long, sharp shadows across the plaza, Vane knew that the real war was only just beginning, and he wouldn't have it any other way. The aftermath of the orbital skirmish did not bring the expected bombardment from the high Hegemony, but rather a chilling, calculated expansion of the conflict into the logistical and psychological theaters. Vane watched the long-range scanners as the retreating ships positioned themselves at the jump gates, effectively placing a noose around the Karsov system. They were not attacking the planet. They were waiting for the planet to do the work for them. Every ounce of energy the humans spent on the Great Forge was energy diverted from their precarious life support systems. The Hegemony's strategy had shifted from direct subjugation to a forced attrition of the soul. They knew that human biology required more than just oxygen and calories. It required hope, and they intended to starve that as well. In the tunnels below, the air had grown thicker, the scrubbers struggling to keep up with the increased industrial output of the shipyard. The humans were now living in a constant state of mild hypoxia, a slow, creeping lethargy that Aris fought back with caffeine and sheer, frantic engineering. Aris was currently buried in the guts of the third frigate hull, her hands trembling slightly as she calibrated the internal dampeners. These were not the sleek, elegant ships of the Karsuvian Navy. They were blocky, brutal things, designed with the same philosophy as the Outpost. They were built to be hit and keep moving. The hulls were composed of a multi-layered composite of local iridium and carbon silicate fibers, a material they had dubbed Karsov steel. It was heavy, difficult to work with, and nearly impervious to the heat-based beam weapons of the Hegemony. As she worked, she felt the rhythmic vibration of the planet's core through the floor. The Great Forge was now operating at 80% capacity, tapping deeper into the mantle than any geological survey had ever recommended. The risk of a planetary-scale tremor was rising, but the alternative was to be trapped on the surface with no way to project force. She knew Vane was betting their lives on the idea that the Hegemony would blink before the planet broke. Inside the High Hegemony's command spire, the discord was no longer a whisper. It was a roar of conflicting interests. The Lithos representatives were furious that their trade networks were being used as a front for a military blockade that yielded no profit. They watched the humans on Karsov 4 through deep space probes, seeing the flickering lights of the forge and the growing silhouettes of the human warships. To the Lithos, the humans were becoming a fixed variable, a physical constant that could not be ignored or wished away. Zolvat, now regarded as an expert on human stubbornness, was called before the Grand Vizier to explain why the three cruisers had failed. He did not speak of tactical errors or technological inferiority. Instead, he projected a holographic image of a human hand, scarred and calloused, gripping a simple lever. He told the Council that the humans were not fighting with their ships, they were fighting with their relationship to pain. He explained that a Karsuvian retreats when the shell is cracked, but a human becomes more dangerous when they are broken. This philosophy was being tested to its absolute limit on the surface of Karsov 4. A massive heat wave, triggered by the forge's deep-bore cooling vents, had pushed the colony's internal temperatures to 40 degrees Celsius. The cooling systems were failing, and the water rations were being cut to the minimum required for survival. Vane walked through the residential sectors, seeing the toll the environment was taking. People were sleeping in the corridors where the air was marginally cooler, their faces gaunt, their skin slick with a constant sheen of sweat. Yet, in the middle of this misery, he saw a group of miners playing a game of cards, betting their future rations on a hand of luck. He saw an engineer teaching a group of children how to read the pressure gauges of the secondary airlocks. The human spirit was not breaking, it was compressing. Like the carbon in the planet's crust, the pressure was turning the soft parts of their community into something harder and more permanent. The Hegemony's next move was a psychological gambit. They broadcasted a wide-spectrum signal across the system, a loop of images showing the luxury and ease of life within the Hegemony's core worlds. They showed gardens that spanned continents, cities that hovered in the clouds, and a life entirely devoid of physical labor or environmental threat. The message was clear: this could be yours if you simply accept the hierarchy. The broadcast played in the human mess halls, on the monitors of the shipyard, and in the private quarters of the command staff. Vane watched as his people stared at the images of a paradise they had never known. For a moment, he feared the contrast would be too much, that the grinding reality of Kasov 4 would finally seem unbearable. But then, a young welder in the back of the room stood up and threw a heavy wrench at the monitor, shattering the image of a hovering city. The room erupted into a cheer that was more of a growl. They didn't want the Hegemony's ease. They wanted the pride of what they had built with their own blood. The confrontation reached a boiling point when the Hegemony sent a small, unarmed diplomatic shuttle to the orbital ring. The envoy was not a Karsuvian or a Lithos, but a member of a client species known as the Vrin, a small, avian-like people who had been part of the Hegemony for 3,000 years. The Vrin envoy was terrified, his feathers ruffled by the heavy gravity of the ring station as he stood before Vane. He brought an ultimatum. The humans must shut down the Great Forge and accept a Hegemony-appointed governor, or the planetary reclamators would be deployed. The reclamators were not warships. They were massive orbital mirrors designed to focus a star's light into a beam that could boil the oceans of a world. It was the ultimate ecological weapon, a way to erase a civilization without firing a single shot. The Vrin envoy pleaded with Vane, telling him that the Hegemony had used this weapon before on worlds that refused to bend. Vane looked at the small, trembling creature and felt a wave of profound pity. The Vrin had forgotten what it was like to say no. They had lived in the shadow of the Hegemony for so long that they believed the universe was a place of absolute rules. Vane took the envoy to the observation window, pointing down at the surface of Kasov 4. He showed him the Great Forge, glowing like a secondary sun in the violet dusk, and the 3 frigate hulls that were now being fitted with their mass driver batteries. He told the envoy that the humans had already lived through the end of their world once, back when they left Earth behind to find a future in the stars. He said that a people who have already lost everything cannot be threatened with loss. He told the Vrin to go back to the Obsidian Spire and tell the Grand Vizier that the humans were not staying on Kasov 4 because they had to. They were staying because they liked the wait. When the envoy departed, Vane called Aris to the command deck. He told her about the reclamators and the threat of planetary boiling. Aris didn't look afraid, she looked thoughtful. She pulled up the blueprints for the Great Forge and the magnetic containment fields they were using to stabilize the mantle. She suggested that if they inverted the polarity of the cooling loops and expanded the field, they could create a localized atmospheric distortion, a lens of their own made of suspended metallic dust and ionized gas. It wouldn't stop the reclamator's beam, but it would scatter it, turning a lethal strike into a chaotic surge of energy that the forge could potentially absorb. It was a mad plan, one that required the humans to essentially turn their entire planet into a giant lightning rod. Vane looked at the math, seeing the thin line between survival and total vaporization. He gave her the green light. The chapter reached its climax as the Hegemony's reclamator ships, 4 massive golden discs, took their positions above the planet. The sky of Kasov 4 began to brighten, the violet dusk turning into a harsh, blinding white as the mirrors began to focus the light of the orange sun. Below, the humans were in a frenzy of activity. They weren't hiding in bunkers. They were at their stations, manually adjusting the emitters of the magnetic field. Vane stood at the center of the forge, the heat rising to an almost unbearable level as the atmospheric lens began to form. The air above the outpost began to shimmer and swirl, a massive cyclone of dust and energy that reached up into the stratosphere. When the first beam struck, the sound was not a bang, but a long, continuous scream of protesting physics. The sky ignited. The golden beam hit the human-made lens and shattered into 1,000 jagged ribbons of light that danced across the horizon. For 6 hours, the humans held the shield. The great forge groaned under the influx of raw energy, the capacitors glowing white-hot as they struggled to store the power of a star. Aris was at the heart of the control room, her hands moving across the interface like a pianist, balancing the load to prevent a catastrophic overload. Every human on the planet felt the vibration of the struggle in their teeth. They were literally standing in the middle of a celestial forge, being hammered by the Hegemony's ultimate weapon, and they were not melting. Instead, they were using that very energy to complete the final welds on their frigates. The Hegemony watched in absolute horror as the humans took the weapon meant to destroy them and used it as a power source. By the time the Reclamator ships were forced to cease fire to prevent their own mirrors from melting, the first human frigate, the Resolute, was already rising from its subterranean cradle, powered by the very light that was meant to boil it. The chapter ended with the Resolute breaking the atmosphere, its hull still glowing from the heat of the forge, its mass drivers primed and ready. It was a singular, terrifying sight, a ship born of fire and gravity, manned by a crew that had just stared down the sun and didn't blink. The Hegemony fleet at the jump gates didn't wait for orders. They saw the human ship, saw the defiance it represented, and they scattered. Vane watched from the bridge of the new vessel, his breathing heavy but rhythmic. He looked at the vast, dark expanse of the galaxy and realized that the humans were no longer just a curiosity or a hardship. They were a force of nature. They had mastered the architecture of friction, the calculus of endurance, and the kinetics of defiance. Now, they were going to teach the Hegemony the most important lesson of all, the gravity of convergence. They were coming for the spire. The approach to the throne world of the High Hegemony was not a sprint, but a slow, rhythmic march through the debris of a crumbling status quo. The Resolute led a small fleet of 4 heavy frigates, each a scarred and blocky testament to the industrial savagery of Kasov 4. They did not use cloaking devices or subtle maneuvers. They moved with the heavy, undeniable momentum of a falling mountain. Around them, the Hegemony's outer defensive pickets simply dissolved. It was not always a matter of combat. In many cases, the crews of the Lithos and Grell vessels, having heard of the failed reclamation of Kasov 4, chose to deactivate their weapon systems rather than face the kinetic fury of the human mass drivers. To these species, the humans were no longer an adversary to be conquered, but a new physical reality to be accommodated. Vane stood on the bridge of the Resolute, his eyes fixed on the holographic projection of the obsidian spire. He felt the vibration of the ship's engines hum through the soles of his boots, a familiar resonance that reminded him of the bedrock they had left behind. Aris was stationed in the heart of the ship's engineering core, managing a power grid that was still surging with the leftover energy of the planetary beam. She had repurposed the massive capacitors to feed the forward shielding, creating a kinetic barrier that could shrug off the concentrated plasma fire of a Hegemony dreadnought. Her team was composed of the same individuals who had moved the Iridium monolith on that first day of provocation, their movements now so synchronized that they functioned as a single, multi-headed organism. There was no conversation, only the sharp, mechanical language of a crew that had learned to trust the machine because they had built it with their own hands. They were the architects of this moment, the ones who had turned the friction of their existence into the propulsion of their revenge. As the fleet entered the inner orbit of the throne world, the sky of the obsidian spire filled with the blue-white glare of the human engines, a new star appearing in the firmament of an ancient empire. The High Hegemony did not surrender easily. A final wall of Karsuvian heavy cruisers, the Ironshell Division, moved to intercept the human fleet. These ships were the pinnacle of Hegemony engineering, their hulls layered with adaptive alloys and their weapons capable of shearing the crust off a moon. The battle that erupted was a collision of 2 fundamentally different philosophies of power. The Karsuvians fought with elegance and precision, their beams cutting through the dark in perfect geometric arcs. The humans fought with the brutal logic of the mass driver, They ignored the shield-flaring heat of the beams, pushing their frigates directly into the path of the fire to ensure their own tungsten slugs hit with maximum velocity. It was a terrifying display of disregard for structural integrity. The Resolute took hit after hit, its outer plating melting and venting atmosphere into the void, but it never veered from its course. To the Hegemony pilots, it was like trying to stop a tide with a sword. You could cut the water, but the weight of it would eventually crush you. Inside the obsidian spire, Zolvat stood before the Grand Vizier, who was pulsing with a frantic, fractured light. The Vizier demanded to know why the Ironshell division was failing, why the most advanced fleet in the galaxy could not stop 4 battered freighters. Zolvat looked at the tactical display, seeing the human ships closing the distance despite the damage they were sustaining. He told the Vizier that the Hegemony had built their power on the assumption that everyone wanted to survive. They had forgotten that some species are born from a history of not being allowed to survive, and for them, the struggle is not a means to an end, but the end itself. He explained that the humans weren't trying to win a war. They were trying to prove that the Hegemony's peace was a lie built on the avoidance of pain. As the Resolute broke through the final line of defense, its forward mass driver aimed directly at the spire's atmospheric stabilizing array. Zolvat felt a strange sense of relief. The weight was finally settling where it belonged. Vane opened a wideband communication channel, his voice broadcasting not just to the spire, but to every corner of the Hegemony that could receive a signal. He did not issue a list of demands or a declaration of conquest. He spoke of the grain of the universe, of the way things are made and the way they are broken. He told the galaxy that humanity had been measured by the weight of their world and had found that weight to be exactly what they needed to stand. He invited the member species of the Hegemony to look at the human ships, to see the scars, the welds, and the raw, unpolished metal. He told them that perfection was a cage, and that the only way to be free was to embrace the friction of being. The silence that followed his words was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of a collective realization. The hierarchy of the physical had been overturned, not by a greater power, but by a greater willingness to endure. The final act of the confrontation was a singular, low-velocity shot from the Resolute's primary mass driver. It was not aimed at the living quarters of the spire, but at the ceremonial pedestal where the High Hegemony kept their ancient relics of authority. The tungsten slug, traveling just fast enough to penetrate the atmospheric shield, struck the pedestal with the force of a tectonic shift. The obsidian spire didn't collapse, but it cracked from its apex to its foundation, a jagged, permanent scar that mirrored the faults of Kasov 4. The humans didn't land their troops. They didn't occupy the cities. They simply hovered there, a reminder that the stars were no longer a protected playground for the elite. They had brought the reality of the rim to the heart of the core, and in doing so, they had established a new equilibrium, one where the strength of a species was measured by how much of the universe they could carry on their backs. As the human fleet turned to begin the long journey back to the Deep Rim, Vane sat in his command chair, watching the throne world recede. His ship was a ruin, held together by emergency patches and the sheer refusal of the crew to let it die. Beside him, Aris leaned against the console, her face smudged with grease and her eyes bright with a weary satisfaction. She noted that the great forge on Kasov 4 was already signaling for the next batch of materials, that the expansion was continuing, and that the other fringe races were now sending envoys not to the Hegemony, but to the humans. They had become the new gravity of the sector, a center of mass that the rest of the galaxy was beginning to orbit. Vane nodded, feeling the exhaustion finally beginning to seep into his bones, a weight that he accepted as the price of their new position. The story of the human expansion into the Hegemony would be told for 10,000 years, but it wouldn't be told as a story of a great war or a brilliant invention. It would be told as the story of the grain, the idea that the universe is made of rough, difficult things that require a certain kind of stubbornness to shape. It would be remembered as the time when the galaxy learned that you don't need to be a god to change the stars. You just need to be willing to bleed for every centimeter of progress. As the Resolute slipped into warp, leaving a trail of cooling plasma in the dark, the humans finally allowed themselves to rest, knowing that no matter how heavy the next world was, they already knew exactly how to move it. The architecture of friction had become the foundation of a new era, and for the first time in history, the weight of the universe felt exactly right.